Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, March 5th. 2024. Almost got that wrong. I actually was just gearing up to say 2023 for some reason. It isn't. It's 2024. It's Super Tuesday. It's so super. I'll tell you how super it is. It's so super that I didn't even realize that Virginia was part of the Super Tuesday primaries. That's how super it is this year. I guess that's the side effect of having two incumbents, essentially, one quasi-incumbent who maybe never have actually been president, running for, supposedly for re-election, though probably just to stage an insurrection at some point, and rallying his troops for an insurrection in 2025 at government expense when he starts getting matching funds. Won't that be fantastic? Okay. Well, anyway, yeah, it is. If you're here in Virginia, you may also have ignored the whole thing. I mean, it's not a contest per se, and the outcome is not in doubt, but, you know, the thing to do is go out, be in the habit of casting votes. That's always helpful, always a good idea, always nice. Feels good to cast your vote. I wouldn't know because I haven't done it yet, but I'm pretty sure based on past experience. Past experience is no guarantee of future returns, however. As you know, we don't even sell any financial services here on the show, but maybe we should. And if we do, we'll be well practiced for it. Okay, so I'll try and make sure that I get everybody out to do their civic duties. Although it occurs to me now that I'm sure that college boy has missed his chance. He won't be coming home anytime today to cast a ballot, but I'll drag graduate out, and we'll see if we can't get production staff who are off-site today to see if they can stop by the local elementary school to cast that ballot before the polls close down at 7, which is a bit of a tight fit these days with commutes being what they are. You know how we are here in Northern Virginia. We love having multiple-hour commutes. Actually, we love opposing it and voting for politicians who say they will fix it and then just, continuing to have the same problems, basically. Anyway, just fine with me. And let's see, other things to check in on. Oh, I don't know. The Supreme Court gave the whole game away yesterday. That's true. It is Tuesday, and Joan McCarter should be joining us with the news that we didn't shut down last Friday, but only because they've kicked the can forward to this Friday, I think. I don't know. We've reached the stage of the shutdown game where I lose track of what shuts down when. I think they may have just kicked the can forward such that the two tranches that last time they insisted on separating have come back together again, which I guess, says that there wasn't much behind the idea of separating them in the first place. They didn't stay separate for long. So we'll catch up on that, and there is some detail available about what is going on and what people are preparing for adopting at the next, or at or before the next government shutdown. I thought I had parked a story about it handy in pocket, but I see that I don't know. I'm not certain sometimes whether the things I click on definitely make it there, depending on what platform I am reading. But let's see. Shall we read? You want to read New York Times or The Hill? The Hill usually tends to make shorter work of these things and sometimes gets into details that others gloss over. Congress unveils long-awaited funding bills ahead of shutdown threat. Greg mentioned yesterday that I think they had 6 of the appropriations bills put together and supposedly ready to go, that they were going to combine into a minibus, which, is a play on the omnibus. Although, I was trying to decide yesterday, the usage of omnibus, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the appropriations bills are rolled up into one. But it does, the past usage has always meant that there was one bill, and I guess whatever was left was rolled up into one. And I suppose if there are 10 or 12 outstanding appropriations bills and they roll 6 of them into one, it's kind of an omnibus. But yeah, I see why they use the minibus terminology. There are still 4 or more outstanding, and it's not everything, so it's not omni, I guess. Although, I don't know. No one ever calls him out on that, so I guess it's really not that important. So here's what Aris Foley says is involved in the next round of next expected round of votes and legislation. Congressional leaders on Sunday, they worked over the weekend. Wow. Finally revealed long-awaited bipartisan bills to fund parts of the government for most of the year. They're going to go all the way to the end. Or, I don't know. I guess, I don't know what they mean by that exactly, most of the year. I mean, it will be most of the year if they fund it all the way through September. If they start now, okay. Technically, that'll be just over most of the year. Well, actually, I don't know. Let's see. I mean, we're already into March. So even if it was all of March, April, May, June, July, August, September. Yes, right. We'd get all the way to the end of September. That would be 7 months. So I guess it is most of the year. Okay. Barely qualifies. Let's see. This sets off a bicameral sprint to avert looming shutdown threats less than a week away. The weekend rollout entails 6 full-year spending bills and to fund a slew of agencies. That's what we have in this country, a slew of them. Until early fall, including the departments of Agriculture, Interior, Transportation. This is interesting. For transportation, they helpfully stop and parenthetically add DOT. Now, I mean, Agriculture and Interior are also departments, and they are the Department of, but I guess very few people refer to the Department of Agriculture as DOA, for instance, which has its own connotation, and maybe that's why they don't use it. DOI, Department of Interior, I do see that sometimes, but maybe that's just sort of a Washington thing. DOT you see everywhere. Everybody understands DOT because you got your state DOTs, D's OT, and everybody recognizes it. But you have state departments of all those other things, too. Anyway, Housing and Urban Development, which everyone knows is HUD, and it tells you so. Veterans Affairs, VA. Justice, DOJ. Commerce and Energy. It's just, I guess that's really it. Most people just don't use the DO format for all those other things, except agency insiders do, of course. Anyway, the 10,050-page bipartisan package, remember when we were going to do everything in 3 pages, includes more than $450 billion in funding for fiscal year 2024. Lawmakers have until Friday to pass the legislation or risk a partial government shutdown. Under a stopgap plan, President Biden signed into law this week to buy more time for spending talks. The package sets aside nearly $100 billion for the HUD and DOT funding bill, with Democrats highlighting increases for the Federal Aviation Administration, the Maritime Administration, and homeless assistance grants, among other areas. How do you like that? The bill also includes $32 billion for tenant-based Section 8 vouchers, important, up $2.1 billion from the previous fiscal year, as members on both sides say more funding is needed to counter rising rents. At the same time, House Republicans say the bill cuts more than $3.2 billion across 19 Department of Transportation and HUD grant programs when compared to the previous year's fiscal levels. So Republicans' takeaway for their personal pride in that one is, we are definitely going to stop giving things to people. That makes them feel good. The bill provides more than $135 billion in non-defense discretionary funding, for annual VA and military construction funding measure. You all know that, by the way? That old appropriations hands, like me. I never was on appropriations, but people who've dealt with appropriations bills know this. But did you know that, that military construction was separate from funding of the Pentagon or Veterans Affairs? It has its own appropriations bill. The MilCon appropriations bill. There's the defense appropriations, there's Veterans Affairs appropriations, and there's military construction appropriations. I don't really know where that came from. It just kind of always has been the case as long as I've been aware of it, but just sort of, I don't know. that makes you feel like an insider. Maybe you take that piece of information away with you and never come back. There you go. All right. Where else were we? Milcon, right? $172 billion in mandatory funding. The bill also includes funding increases for VA medical care, the Benefits Administration, as well as medical and prosthetics research. Gotta cover a little bit of everything. The Sunday rollout comes as Congress falls behind. What? In finishing up on its funding work for fiscal year 2024, which began 5 months ago. Yeah. The GOP-led House and Democratic-led Senate entered negotiations with vastly different bills this year, as House Republicans pursued much more partisan measures with steep cuts to government funding that went beyond budget caps agreed to as part of the debt limit deal brokered between President Biden and that other guy who no longer is in power, Kevin McCarthy. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said upon the package's unveiling on Sunday that the party both sides, that both sides, I guess, were able to reach a funding compromise that will, some copy problems here, that will, quote, the government open without cuts or poison pill riders, except there are cuts, but okay. However, Republicans are already claiming wins in the funding package, touting, well, cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, helpfully referred to here as the EPA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which we just leave at ATF these days, and the Bureau of Investigation at the federal level, which, I don't know, it doesn't say that there's any sort of letter abbreviation for it. That's weird. I didn't even realize. All right, well, at any rate, that also is in the funding package. Republicans highlighted some changes notched in the package, including measures that they said would cut endangered species listing activities at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and another aimed at protecting gun rights of veterans seeking assistance with benefits. I guess that means if you are going to the VA to argue with them about your benefits, if you're going to their office, you can go there armed. Isn't that great? I don't know what else that means or why it needs any assistance or who thinks that's an important issue. Anyway, they've also cheered changes aimed at bolstering oversight of foreign ownership of agricultural land and preventing the, quote, sale of oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China, unquote. I don't know why it needed to be quoted, but okay. And funding boosts to the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, to partly support efforts tackling fentanyl, Speaker Mike Johnson's office said. One way to tackle the problem with fentanyl would be to stop giving it out for free at the White House medical office like they were doing during the Trump administration, but I digress. Well, it doesn't have to be a digression. It could be the rest of the show. We could talk about that one. Anyway, I do wonder why they had to quote sale of oil to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China. If that's prohibited, it's prohibited. Why you have to quote it, I don't know. Maybe the author is afraid of being accused of plagiarism later if they were ever in any, I don't know, academic position or to apply to for work at an Ivy League institution. You plagiarized this line from the appropriations bill. Well, but that's what it does. Anyway, even with divided government and a historically small House majority, House Republicans have worked hard to successfully move the policy and spending priorities of the federal government away from the previous Pelosi-Schumer FY23 appropriations, and American taxpayers will benefit from it, Johnson said in a statement that no one will pay any attention to. This legislation forbids the Department of Justice from targeting parents exercising their right to free speech before school boards, because that's still an issue, sure, while it blocks the Biden administration from stripping Second Amendment rights from veterans, he said. So that's the big picture wins for Republicans in this one. It prevents the Department of Justice from going after parents exercising their free speech rights before school boards, which they weren't doing, but now they are also not allowed to do on top of not doing it. And you can bring your gun with you when you go to a VA office now. Republicans say the package would mean roughly 10% cuts for the EPA. Remember how we weren't having cuts? As appropriators on both sides have warned of tight budget constraints while crafting this year's appropriations bills under the rules set by the previous debt ceiling deal. However, Democrats also argue current funding still maintains staffing levels across the agency's programs. House Republicans say the total package marks the first overall cut to non-defense, non-VA spending in almost a decade. Under the budget caps agreement struck last year, the Congressional Budget Office said the overall deal could reduce projected deficits by about $1.5 trillion over the next decade. Other cuts Republicans have highlighted included a 6% cut to the FBI, as some conservatives have accused the agency of political weaponization. In a breakdown of the cut, the party highlighted a $654 million cut to the FBI's operating budget, or a 6% reduction. Wow. Anyway, it also pointed to a $621.9 million cut to the agency's construction account, which it said amounted to a 95% cut. Ooh, well, don't build any more FBI buildings. Overall, Democrats say lawmakers provide $37.5 billion for the Department of Justice in its funding bill, which also includes dollars for the Commerce Department and science agencies. Some areas that have received funding boosts above fiscal year 2023 include NASA, climate research under the National Science Foundation, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I know this is dry, boring stuff, but occasionally it pays to remind people just how many of these freaking agencies there are and all the things that the federal government does, even though there's one party dedicated to insisting that they do absolutely nothing, and that they're going to cut all this money, and then they don't cut most of the money. Anyway, Democrats it's good. I'm glad they don't. Democrats have also lauded securing money to, quote, fully fund, like, quote, all right, special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. You may know it as WIC, okay, which provides food assistance to millions of low-income families. You may know it in old school days as food stamps. This measure includes $7 billion for the program, up more than $1 billion in above fiscal year 2023 levels, as Democrats have pressed for more dollars to address a shortfall. All right. However, the bill did not appear to include changes to the what you actually know as food stamps, the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's true. That's more along the lines of the old school food stamps program, although WIC has been a long-standing and very successful and very much needed nutritional supplemental program. But if you're not a woman, an infant, or a child, well, what do? You turn to SNAP. So no changes to SNAP, but these changes that they were talking about are ones sought by Republicans, which means people should starve, and I guess it didn't work. So great. Some Republicans were looking for changes as part of the negotiations aimed at ensuring recipients were using benefits to buy, quote, nutritional foods, while also limiting access to food items like soda and candy, which is interesting and not terrible because, they should be spending their limited resources on things that will actually do them more good than things like soda and candy. But then again, Republicans are usually the ones screaming and crying freedom, something, something. But I don't know. They got a chance to punish poor people or make poor people feel like they're being monitored. So they're going to try and do that. But they're going to fail, which is actually in some ways probably too bad. But we don't really need any more complication on top of these things. Why not simply, do your job and give the people the money that they need to buy what they want to buy and hope that they do better? That does sound kind of Republican. I don't know why they wouldn't leave or why they would leave that on the table. Anyway, some Gops negotiators argued ahead of the rollout that Democrats gained leverage in funding talks as leadership struggled, it says just struggle, to unify members amid deep divides on spending. House Gops leadership is expected to bring up funding legislation next week. I think they mean this week now. This is perhaps a Sunday article. Under suspension of the rules for procedure fans, given staunch resistance from hardline conservatives that have been pressing for lower overall funding and partisan riders. While that would allow the House to bring up legislation without having to do a procedural vote first, that means a rule, right? We're going to do this under suspension of the rules. So obviously, what's the one thing you don't need when you're suspending the rules? A rule, right? So no trip to the Rules Committee on that. But of course, it would also require a 2/3 vote of the chamber to support passage instead of the usual simple majority threshold, meaning Democratic support will be necessary to get those measures across the finish line, which is, I guess, why they are constructed the way they are constructed. Fantastic, I guess. Good, so much the better. And wow, a 2/3 vote. That was also, by the way, what it would take to remove the disability of Donald Trump to serve as President of the United States or hold any office under the United States as an insurrectionist. So, it's of some interest. The reality is, we finally wrap this piece up, that if you have to pass these things by suspension, you've given Democrats more strength. Oh no, they're almost half the chamber. I can't believe you would give them strength. Mike Simpson of Idaho complains. He heads the subcommittee that oversees the funding for the Interior Department, which probably settled its issues on a pretty fairly bipartisan basis anyway, so we really don't know what he's crying about, but he needs to be an Idahoan Republican, I guess, and grouse that they didn't beat up enough poor people from other states or something. Anyway, I can't tell you how many times during negotiations what we heard from the other side was, hey, we're going to bring 200 votes to pass these by suspension. What are you going to bring? It's funny that that's his way out of, that's his exit quote. Like, yeah, here's the dumb thing the other side said. Actual ground truth and talking sense about how things are going, how bills should be written if there's going to be a vote on them and they're going to pass, right? Why should we have more of these things in here that Democrats want? Well, we're the ones who are going to actually provide the bulk of the votes to pass this thing. What are you bringing? Nothing? Yeah. All right. So then you don't get to write it. The end. I mean, you could write it. It just won't pass. So shut up, I guess. All right. Good reminder of the effect that adopting these things, bringing them to the floor under suspension of the rules, is creating. And, of course, a reminder that comes from Freedom Caucus foot stomping. And this is how you have to work around them. And ironic that the tougher you are and the more firmly you put your foot down as an ultra-conservative, the more liberal the resulting legislation. Never change, I guess, or at least don't change for the time being, because it's just perfectly fine with me. And then if control of the House is handed over to Democrats, they'll just simply ignore you and pass things by regular order that do largely the same thing. That is interesting how ineffective the Freedom Caucus has become and how they started life as showstoppers. Oh, well. Just thought I would point that out. And, yeah, well worth our time. I guess I could have done this closer to Joan McCarter's visit, but this is good background. And maybe she wants to talk about other things. And, well, for one thing, she's always entitled to do that. And, there's a lot going on that might be occupying her mind that she'd rather talk about. Like, for instance, I don't know, that crazy decision from the Supreme Court yesterday. I have something to share with you on, I guess, close to procedural grounds about that, which, who shared this one with me? Our friend San Francisco Bay transplant / California transplant, who sent along, is this it? Where is this thing? Yeah, here's a weird thing that happened on the way to finding out what the hell happened on the court yesterday. From Mark Joseph Stern, written over at Slate. I think this just came to me via email. And let's see if I can just track that all down and make sure that I have that right. Yes, okay, right. Supreme Court forgets to scrub metadata was the email topic here. Supreme Court inadvertently reveals confounding late change in Trump ballot ruling, Mark Joseph Stern points out. So there's a little bit of technology and a little bit of procedure in this one. plus a little bit of, legal studies. The Supreme Court's decision on Monday to keep Donald Trump on Colorado's ballot was styled as a unanimous one, an old-timey editor might say, without any dissents. And I know that bothered a lot of people, and people were like, well, I don't understand. What's the point? The three liberal justices, why didn't they stand up and fight? Well, there's an explanation wrapped up in this. Now, we're going to bump into our first break. And so I don't know how far I want to get into this, but you should stay tuned because you're going to want to hear about this. I'll start over again. The Supreme Court's decision on Monday to keep Trump on Colorado's ballot was styled as a unanimous one without any dissents. But the metadata tells a different story. Metadata, who cares? That's not part of a Supreme Court decision. But it is, in a way, sort of. On the page, a separate opinion by the liberal justices is styled as a concurrence in the judgment, authored jointly by the trio. In the metadata of the link to the opinion posted by the court, however, I don't know, this is kind of crazy. This opinion is styled as an opinion concurring in part and dissenting in part, authored not by all three justices, but by Sonia Sotomayor alone. Now, this requires a little bit of additional understanding of how Supreme Court decisions are written and published. And usually you don't run into this, but yeah, I guess if you go to law school, you start to see enough of these things. You read enough cases, you start to realize that sometimes the shorthand by which the decisions are reported to you through the news media don't do full justice to the nuance of things. They just tell you some bottom line score, 9-0.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue on then with Mark Stern's retelling of what happened with the Supreme Court decision on the Colorado ballot ban, essentially removing or agreeing that Colorado could remove Donald Trump from the ballot under the 14th Amendment. And by way of background, I was just reminding people that, very often Supreme Court decisions, the easier to read ones, are reported like horse race campaign coverage. Decision was 6-3 or 9-0 or 5-4. And that's a real thing, but sometimes it leaves out some of the nuances. And sometimes as you know, sometimes cases involve more than one issue, and sometimes it's not entirely clear what the partisan breakdown really was on every aspect of the case. But if a case, say, involves the right to access to abortion, but also some other side issues, or some of the foundational reasoning for which, by which the court reaches their decision. If there's a partisan breakdown on the question of yes or no, are you going to be able to access this type of care? They'll say, well, it was a 5-4 decision overruling, previous precedent that established the right to this care. And they will not bother in the headlines anyway, though sometimes in the body of the article, telling you that, well, it was 6-3 on the question of whether or not the court had the jurisdiction to take up the case in the first place, and then once they decided it, it was a 5-4 decision, or sometimes it was a 6-3 decision on the bottom line, or that bottom line, really the headline portion of the case, but there was a split 4-4 split on whether or not the remedy proposed was the correct one, with one additional justice writing a partial concurrence and partial dissent. But for the purposes of was this remedy available, there was a 5-4 majority. But whether or not the people could, whether or not the remedy should be administered by via a remand to the court below so that the lower courts could reconsider the question, was a closer case. One justice saying, no, we can just simply direct it from the Supreme Court rather than sending it back. These small bore issues sometimes contain a different box score. They would come out differently on the box score if we were covering everything as horse race. Horse racing, I don't think, actually has box scores. But, we're going to do the sports analogy thing. Anyway, the point is that the layman's understanding of the way Supreme Court decisions are presented gives you only two options. You are either joining the majority in a concurrence, or you are joining the minority in a dissent. And it's so much more complicated than that. And you can have sort of split decisions. You can have a decision that's, as I explained, it's 6-3 on one question, but 5-4 on another question that is also integral to the case, but just so long as you have a majority for each of the necessary working parts, it doesn't really matter. And then some justices will sign on to the majority brief with no side notes. And then, of course, there are separate concurrences where you say, all right, sometimes a 5-4 decision is, well, there's an opinion for 3 justices that says X, and an opinion for 2 justices that say, I concur insofar as the question is part A of these 3 justices' decisions, which makes it a 5-4 majority for part A of that decision. But in part B, we have something different. Only one of us concurs in that, but there's another justice somewhere else who is in dissent, but they concur with part A. You get all sorts of weird combinations. So how does that pertain? What does that mean in a 9-0 decision? Usually nothing, right? But it turns out there's games even beyond all of that. Sometimes, I guess in the era of I don't need to actually be a member of the Electoral College to cast electoral votes. I'll just forge Electoral College certificates and send them to Congress and hope that somebody convinces the vice president that they're empowered to pretend that they believe they're real. I guess in that era, you can say, well, what if we took your dissent and labeled it a concurrence instead? Would that be okay with you? And ordinarily, no, it's not. But it brings up the other question. Not only is it not okay in most cases, you can't do it. Like, I don't agree with you. How is that a concurrence? Well, I don't know. But suppose we said it was. Would that be okay? Well, no. But suppose you got to the answer yes on that. Would it be okay to take something that disagrees with the majority opinion and call it a concurrence? Why would you? I don't know. There's reasons explained. Reasons offered anyway in this piece, which we'll get to. I just want to sort of pose, that's how weird the question is, I guess. And you should be aware of that. Okay. So, what the hell are we talking about? You might ask. And I might answer you, or I might just turn to Mark Joseph Stern to answer you. So here we go. Yes, we left off by hinting that, not only was this complex nuance in need of exploration, but in order to find the explanation, you would have to be looking at the metadata of the link to the opinion posted by the court. This is sometimes made less complicated when the court takes the bench to deliver its opinion instead of just simply publishing it, because at that point you can say to the public, by the way, I'm listed as a concurrence here, but there's some serious nuance that I would like to put on the record. And this may be the explanation for why they didn't take the bench. It would have been too confusing, weird, or impossible to maintain what increasingly is looking like a facade of unanimity. But there's a political aim to the unanimity here. So here we go. In the metadata of the link to the opinion posted by the court, the opinion is styled as an opinion concurring in part and dissenting in part. That is, this piece written and signed onto by the three so-called liberal justices, authored not by all three, but by Sonia Sotomayor alone. Even a tech-phobic reader can discern this incongruity through careful copying and pasting, piercing the facade of unanimity that the conservative justices sought to present. Now, copying and pasting is linked here, and I'm curious what it goes to. And it is Stern himself, I guess, explaining what the hell he means on Twitter, where he says, if you double click, he's got a screen grab of the opinion here, which in typical printing fashion, it reads, okay, so there's a line up here that says cite as, so when you're citing this case as precedent, they try to, they codify how you can refer to it so that people can look it up, but it doesn't have a page number yet. So cite as, it'll be 601 US blank. We don't know what page yet. Decided in 2024. And then up at the top, it says Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson justices. That's JJ. They then put up there. That's plural for justices. So justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson concurring in judgment. And then Supreme Court of the United States, the docket number 23-719, Donald J. Trump petitioner versus Norma Anderson et al. On writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court of Colorado. Justice Sotomayor, Kagan, and Justice Jackson concurring in the judgment. We read this portion of the decision now. Now, if you were to look at this on your screen through the link that was provided by the Supreme Court, and you double-clicked where it says JJ at the top, and then copy and paste it, like, I don't know why you would do that, but he did do that, that line reads, Sotomayor, J, Justice, concurring in part and dissenting in part. And if you do a Control F search for Sotomayor, J, concurring in part and dissenting in part, it highlights the same line. That doesn't really help explain things to people who aren't tech savvy. But what he's saying here is it looks like the liberals' opinion was originally styled as a partial dissent written by Justice Sotomayor, but got changed to a concurrence in the judgment authored jointly by all three liberals. I see that the copy-paste approach doesn't work on every computer, but the Control-F approach should, he goes on to say. And then he says it's also still in the metadata, referring to Jake Halloran's pointing out, yeah, they left the entire header of it in the PDF source, LOL, more tech stuff. But basically telling us that the copy, cut, and pasted document that got issued by the court was put together from pieces written separately by various justices, and instead of being unified in a single document and retyped and recast this way, they left in there data that indicates whose computer it came from and who actually wrote it and who didn't. So what does this mean? Or perhaps the better question is the one he asks next. What happened? Most obviously, he continues in his article, the Supreme Court rushed out this opinion and forgot to check the metadata. Who knew that they had to even do that? Well, court insiders know they have to do that. The court, after all, scheduled the opinion's release only one day earlier, on Sunday afternoon, right? That's what caught everybody's attention. Evidently, to hand it down before today's Colorado primary. Moreover, the justices did not take the bench to announce the opinion, as they usually do, probably because they had not all planned to be in D.C., further proving that it was a last-minute release. The deeper question remains, of course, why was an opinion originally authored by a lone justice as a partial dissent transformed into a concurrence authored by all three liberals together? And you might wonder, well, how can you even do that? If Justice Sotomayor wrote it, why are they saying three people joined in writing it? Well, they sort of may have in the end, but why bother, right? Why not simply say, well, I didn't write it, but I concur in it? There's always that. Why would they do such a thing? And then, of course, well, what about this idea of them not taking the bench? One reason might be that they're not all in D.C. They weren't planning on that because this was a last-minute thing. But it may also be, and I don't think he disagrees in explaining things in the rest of the article, it may also be that, well, if they take the bench, the temptation at a minimum is overwhelming to say, well, while we're here and we have everybody's attention, I'd like to raise awareness of the actual nuances behind our concurrence. And then everyone will have to write that story, or will be able to write that story. As it stands, only people who are willing to guess, even if it's an informed and educated guess like Mark Stern here, that's all that people will be able to publish is suppositions about this stuff. But this is a good one. We cannot know with any real certainty. We may never, but we can certainly speculate, he says, and that's absolutely true. And here he goes. First, a recap. And this too is linked. So, I guess the recap is this to one of his own earlier pieces about it as he was digesting it yesterday. The Supreme Court's, quote, unanimous Trump ballot ruling is actually a 5-4 disaster. He sets the stage by with this earlier piece from 11:56 a.m. yesterday, and this now a summation piece explaining things. Maybe we should read that one first. This one with the benefit of a few more hours of thought at 4:58 p.m. What do we think here? How long would it take us to get through this other part? Well, if things aren't entirely clear by the end of this later piece, perhaps we'll jump back earlier in time. But I think he's trying to give us the recap. The meat of this earlier article is included here. The recap: the Supreme Court ruled that an individual state may not disqualify a presidential candidate from the ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars insurrectionists from regaining public office. Okay? All 9 justices agreed with this bottom line. That's why they come away and say, well, we have a 9-0 unanimous decision. They all, in the end, said, all right, Colorado alone cannot just say you're off the ballot. That's not enough authority. And they may have had different reasons for believing it, but all 9 of them, in the end, were willing to say this should not have happened. May be a mistake, but that's what they're saying. 5 justices went further, declaring that only Congress may enforce Section 3 against federal candidates, and that was particularly bizarre and stupid, I thought, but that's why they could only get 5 people to agree with that one. But in the end, you're back on the ballot, so who cares? 9-0. Or people say, for other reasons, I don't think Colorado should be able to do this. In a brief opinion, Justice Amy Coney Barrett said, the court should not have reached this broader question about congressional authority. Sotomayor made the same point in a longer, more acerbic opinion, joined, ostensibly anyway, by Justices Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Her opinion was styled as a concurrence, but we know that it was actually, probably until late in the drafting process, labeled a dissent. We also know that the opinion was originally ascribed only to Sotomayor. This is what he had written earlier, and what they've come to discover from the metadata. But okay, so only 5 justices were willing to sign on to the idea that Congress is the one that can enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the 3 liberals said no, someone else can do the enforcement. They just didn't do it right, and this wasn't the right way for Colorado. And Amy Coney Barrett joined in saying we really should not only not have given Congress this responsibility, but we should never have even taken up the question of who gets to do that. Just that whoever it is, it was done wrong here. And here you can see where all the splits and nuance can arise in any case. Now the speculation. We can guess that the bulk of this opinion, the liberals part, the concurrence of Sotomayor and the other two, we can guess that the bulk of this opinion was authored by Sotomayor herself. It bears some of the justices' trademarks, including a realpolitik assessment of the majority's handiwork and stormy rhetoric about its consequences for democracy. In addition, during oral arguments last month, Sotomayor sounded the most skeptical of Trump and his various legal theories. Perhaps after arguments, the court convened to vote on the case, and a majority settled on a sweeping rationale in Trump's favor. Not only can Colorado not do this, but only Congress has the authority to decide whether or not someone is a banned insurrectionist. Doesn't say that. It says actually the opposite in the text, but never mind that, right? Okay. Sotomayor then moved forward with a dissent, faulting the majority's overreach. It doesn't say that. At some point, the dissent turned into the opinion that appeared yesterday, concurring in the judgment, which leads to the second question. Why did a standalone Sotomayor dissent transform into a 3-justice concurrence? Not just how, but why. Right? Here, the most rational intuition is that Kagan and Jackson were keeping their votes fluid in the hopes of striking a bargain to avert a gratuitously broad opinion, effectively repealing the insurrection clause, which is what the majority ended up doing, the 5. This bargain may have been simple. The 2 justices might have joined with Barrett to seek a 5th vote for a narrow holding, presumably from Roberts. That is, he's back on the ballot, but not because Congress is the only one with this authority, just that the authority as exercised by Colorado is improper. That's a different decision than not only can Colorado not do it, but basically nobody can, because only Congress can remove people from the ballot, which is, just not grounded in anything ever, and of course is directly contrary to the plain language of the amendment, at least insofar as Section 3 is concerned. Section 5 is where they borrow that authority from, and that's not altogether crazy, but it is in effect once you realize enabling legislation that's mentioned in Section 5 is actually disabling legislation with respect to Section 3. So, kind of weird to say the least. Anyway, so the bargain that they may have had in their minds would be to see if they could get if they teamed up all 3 of the justices and then added Barrett to the mix with the idea that maybe we should just say, no, Congress doesn't really have a role in this, and at least not this role that they're discussing. But they couldn't find a 5th vote for that one, so it was never going to be the majority opinion. The majority was, I guess, stuck in their ways. They definitely wanted a broad, sweeping opinion that says Congress has to rule that somebody is an insurrectionist or something like that, even though that's bizarre. Or they have to pass a law that specifically criminalizes insurrection with a definition that fits something like what Trump provably did, even though they also already have one of those on the books, 18 U.S. Code Section 2383, the sets on foot prohibition. One of my favorites. I mean, it's become one of my favorites anyway. So anyway, It may be that the other two liberal justices were trying to work with Barrett to look for a fifth vote for a narrow holding. Maybe they thought Roberts would give that vote to him. All the while, Sotomayor worked on the fallback option, a partial dissent, chastising the majority's overreach, right? Easy for Sotomayor to say. That's crazy for these five justices to say that Congress has to act in order to keep an insurrectionist from running. It's right here in the Constitution. Why do they have to? What good would a statutory act be in the face of an existing constitutional prohibition against insurrectionists running for Congress? This would be not only just belt and suspenders, but I mean, you have the particularly robust forum of the Constitution standing behind you. There's really, I mean, what's the point of passing something inferior in its stature to the Constitution? There is no point. It's a blanket prohibition. But since they were now going to rule it non-existent, then the next best thing would be to pass a statute. But why should we have to? So you could certainly see that there should be a rather stinging dissent from this. And it might have turned out to be as much a 4-vote dissent saying Congress has no role here. But one of the brokers here is Amy Coney Barrett, and she doesn't want to be seen as dissenting from the other 5 of her conservative teammates. But she does, I don't know, she feels some pang of conscience here, or believes that the true old school conservative answer to this, old school conservative justices were, in years gone by, the ones who said, no, we need to narrow our ruling. The less sweeping the precedent, the more conservative it is by nature. And I guess she couldn't find any among the other 5 to agree with that for some reason. So all the while, Sotomayor works on the fallback option, a partial dissent, chastising the majority's overreach. When Kagan and Jackson realized that they couldn't nab a 5th vote for the narrow position, then they teamed up with Sotomayor, making a few changes and signing their names as authors in a show of force and agreement with the progressive bloc. The description of presidential elections as it is added parenthetically here. The description of presidential elections as, quote, a great and glorious thing, for example, sounds to Mark Stern like the work of Kagan or Jackson, not Sotomayor. So anyway, that he thinks is one of their additions. They now say, all right, we can't cobble together 5 votes for narrowing the decision about Congress having a role here. So the next best thing, we'll join with Sotomayor in this partial concurrence, Trump's back on the ballot, and partial dissent, no, it doesn't require an act of Congress to kick someone off the ballot. Broaden the scope of the potential negotiations, though, and things get more interesting. Why broaden the scope? Well, after oral arguments, many smart court watchers mused that the justices might reach a grand bargain that tied this case to a separate dispute involving Trump's claims of immunity from criminal prosecution for election subversion, right? There's that one was brought, and then everybody thought, well, they made the D.C. Circuit go first. The D.C. Circuit wrote what people were saying, well, this is solid. This is ironclad. There's no reason for the SCOTUS to take this up. They can just pass on this entirely and leave the D.C. Circuit decision in place as the controlling law for the moment. Right? That was the speculation that they might do that. So it's interesting. Smart court watchers mused that they might decide, well, given that we have these 2 cases in front of us, what if we say, all right, everybody expects us to put Trump back on the ballot, but what if we threw the other side a bone here and said, fine, we'll put Trump back on the ballot, but we'll decline to review the immunity case and say, yeah, the idea that Trump or any president is just immune from prosecution for everything and anything is stupid. We're not going to waste our time with it. So a win for the Trump team in putting him back on the ballot, but he still has to supposedly win the election. They're discounting the idea that he'll just cheat or stage a coup anyway. But at the same time, we'll throw a bone to the other team too. He's not immune. At least you have that, right? The smart court watchers thought that was the deal they were going to make. Well, smart court watchers turned out to be wrong, and the court was far more audacious than anybody thought and said, actually, we're going to possibly throw a win, at least temporarily, both of them to Trump. You're back on the ballot, and we'll entertain that you might be immune, and at the very least, delay your trial while we ponder it. So how smart was that, court watching? Not very. But people were thinking at the time that the liberal justices might agree to keep Trump on the ballot if the court also refused to take up the immunity case. There would be an exchange of votes. Trump stays on the ballot but gets no immunity from prosecution. He could run in all 50 states, but would also have to contend with a criminal trial that would likely conclude before the election. Well, that didn't happen. The court instead sided with Trump on the ballot issue and took up his immunity case last week on a less than speedy timeline, helping him run out the clock to November. But maybe Kagan and Jackson were working behind the scenes to strike this grand bargain. Maybe they were withholding their votes in both cases, scrambling to find two conservative justices who would rule narrowly for Trump in one case, this one, today's, and swiftly against him in the other. Well, if so, that didn't happen either. But it would still make sense for Kagan and Jackson to withhold their votes in both cases until they got confirmation that no compromise lay on the horizon in either dispute. Then there is what he calls the least interesting possibility that Sotomayor's opinion was going to be a partial dissent until Roberts and Barrett prevailed upon her to call it a concurrence in a bid to look unanimous and turn the national temperature down, in Barrett's words. Well, it's frankly difficult to see Sotomayor, an independent-minded and principled jurist, buying into this stratagem if she got nothing out of it. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. How about some more? We were just reading about the weird nuances of the Sotomayor, mostly Sotomayor, authored opinion that became labeled a concurrence when it really started life as at least partial dissent. So what's going on? We were just in the middle of explaining Mark Stern's least interesting possibility, as he puts it, that Sotomayor's opinion was going to be a partial dissent until Roberts, our legacy is in danger, and Barrett together come to her and say, well, what if you just called it a concurrence? Because in the end, you think that Trump should be back on the Colorado ballot, right? Okay, yes. So why don't we just call it a concurrence and leave it at that? Well, but I'm dissenting from the majority's opinion with respect to Congress's role in all of this. Yes, but why don't we we can print everything you say, but why don't we just leave the word dissent out so that we can say it was a 9-0 decision so that there isn't protest and division in the country. They'll all unify behind our unified front here at the Supreme Court. I mean, that seriously misreads what people think about the court these days, or maybe ever, but it was a play. Remember, Amy Coney Barrett thinks, according to her opinion in this case, that they are able to, quote, turn the national temperature down if there's a 9-0 decision that everybody just agrees is a big love-in to keep Trump on the ballot. I don't know that turns anything down, but that's what Barrett is hoping for. But as he writes, it's difficult to see Sotomayor, independent and principled as she is, buying into this idea if she doesn't get anything out of it. And this theory doesn't explain why the other two liberals signed on as authors apparently so late in the game. But There is always another bargain to seek, another compromise to pursue. Who knows what these three justices might have received in exchange for removing the word dissent from this opinion. We don't know. That's true. But it might be wish casting to think that there is anything. Although it is entirely possible that they may have been led to believe that there was something that they would get out of it, and that the majority would eventually renege and not give them that thing. That's certainly possible. But you would think they would have held out for at least the illusion of getting something, as opposed to just saying, I don't know, I just didn't feel like making you upset. But that too is a possibility, right? Well, why upset colleagues when in the end we all do think that Trump should be on the ballot, which is a failing, but, you know, it happened. If you think that he should be on the ballot, why bother with dissent? I mean, I guess they could be saying, well, we need to safeguard our own reputations as well, but you could also, I suppose, be convinced, well, we're not going to get the outcome we want, and we're not going to get the outcome we want in the immunity case for the time being anyway, at least temporarily, not the outcome we wanted, even if we get the ruling in the end. But the timing will be all screwed up and various other things that are problematic about that decision. Why also upset colleagues? Maybe it's as simple as that. Anyway, right, so if there's always another bargain to seek and another compromise to pursue, maybe there was something that they got in exchange for removing the word dissent from the opinion. Maybe they needed to call the opinion a concurrence to wrench a separate opinion out of Barrett. You know, it is odd, right, that Barrett separates herself from the conservative bloc and says, yeah, Congress really does not have this role here. There doesn't need to be enabling legislation to bar someone from the ballot as an insurrectionist. Something else might have to happen, a conviction under an insurrection statute perhaps, but not a specific act of Congress, nor does it require an act of Congress to do this. But, okay. So why bother? One might wonder. Well, I don't know, but perhaps she expressed those doubts and was then wooed by both the liberals. Well, if you can bring another person along for narrowing the ruling, we can come to the conclusion you want Trump on the ballot, but also deliver the reasoning you want. But if she couldn't bring that other person along, was it important for her to state that belief at all? Well, it's costless for her to state that belief. But I guess if one side is saying, no, join us so that it looks more like a solid, not a 5-4 decision. We're trying to avoid 5-4s if we can. So please join us in a 6-3. Or she was like, well, no, I really do think you're wrong about this. And it won't change the outcome, and it doesn't really hurt anybody for me to state this, so I'm going to state it. But it may also have been the other liberal justices saying, well, if it's going to come out this way, and Trump's going to be put back on the ballot, and we're going to end up granting cert and effectively extending the stay on the immunity case, then at least throw us the bone of putting together a sizable minority for the belief that Congress doesn't have this role, after all, in which doesn't exist anywhere in the text, in barring insurrectionists by specific action. So she agrees to do it. Where were we in this? Maybe they wanted to call the opinion a concurrence. Why? So that Barrett would feel comfortable joining them. Otherwise, you only have 3 votes against a rule whereby Congress has some specific role in enforcing Section 3, as opposed to the one role they were actually assigned, undoing Section 3. But okay. But if you call it a dissent, I, Amy Coney Barrett, won't sign it. But if you call it a concurrence, I will sign it. I don't want to look like I'm separating from the conservative wing even though I am in substance. But if you put this window dressing on it and call it a separate concurrence, then I'm okay with it. So they said, well, if we change the label on it, but not what it says, we'll get a fourth vote. And we'll be able to point and say, not all, the moral strength of our argument peeled off a vote of the conservative bloc. That's always a win. Let's take it. That's an explanation. So where were we with this? Maybe they needed to call the opinion a concurrence to wrench a separate opinion out of Barrett, one she might not have offered otherwise, criticizing the majority. Barrett strived to frame the outcome as a reflection of friendly unanimity. Perhaps she threatened to paper over her disagreement with the conservative bloc unless the liberals dropped the word dissent to keep up the facade of cross-ideological agreement. Or maybe Barrett was on the fence about whether to grant Trump a full stay in his immunity case. Remember, we talked about how they engineered a 4-vote effective stay when really a full actual stay requires 5 votes. Maybe there was, in fact, this cross-case grand bargain, and she was on the fence about whether to grant a full stay in the immunity case and push the case to the next term's docket, delaying even further. Instead of hearing it on a marginally expedited basis this term, i.e. without an actual stay. If so, perhaps the concurrence language was the price of her vote there. I'll vote not to simply grant a stay and push this case to October 2025 if you will just change the label of your opinion from partial dissent to concurrence, separate concurrence. And if you do that, one, I'll let you say that there was bipartisan sentiment and a closely divided court on the question of whether or not Congress has this role that the majority assigns to them. And although there still is an effective stay on the immunity case, at least it's not a full stay, and they'll have to argue this case this term, and people will expect us to answer by June, as opposed to not even holding arguments until next October. Well, maybe. If so, perhaps that concurrence language was the price of that bargain. Whatever the liberals were able or not to eke out of the conservative justices, it appears to have been thin gruel indeed, right? They didn't get much out of anything out of it. But such guesswork is ultimately somewhat of a fool's errand, so we spent an hour on it. But it's irresistible when the Supreme Court leaves such a big clue dangling in the metadata. And then parenthetically he adds, I asked the court for comment on Monday, but I haven't received a response. Why is it in there? Whatever happened behind the scenes, the final product is plenty fractured on its own terms. The liberal justices can call their opinion whatever they want. At the end of the day, it reads exactly like what it is, a furious and fearful dissent. So, okay. Well, that is a very different view of things. Does it make any sense, though, to double back and look at his earlier writing on this? Let's see if it clarifies anything. Because this was a bit of a stem winder, and that's my fault, really, for trying to elaborate and I thought clarify, but every time I thought I was clarifying, I ended up probably obfuscating what was going on. What about his earlier piece? The Supreme Court's unanimous, quote unquote, unanimous Trump ballot ruling is actually a 5-4 disaster. I think we maybe need to explain that a little bit more. Maybe we let him do the talking this time. It starts off with all the regular stuff. You know, on Monday, they reversed Colorado's Supreme Court decision. But the top line holding is where the unanimity ended because 5 conservative justices just couldn't help themselves. They went much further than the case required, announcing an entirely new rule that Congress alone, through, quote, a particular kind of legislation, I don't know what that even means, may enforce the constitutional bar on insurrectionists holding office. As the three liberal justices pointed out in a separate opinion that glows white hot with indignation, which concurrences usually don't, by the way. The majority's overreach, quote, attempts to insulate all alleged insurrectionists from future challenges to their holding federal office, unquote. They are, of course, correct. After this decision, it is impossible to imagine a federal candidate, up to and including the president, ever being disqualified from assuming office because of their participation in an insurrection. And that seems like a bit of a nullification of a major part of the Constitution. Monday's case, Trump versus Anderson, is proof positive that the Supreme Court can act at rapid speed to resolve a dispute of national importance, at least when Trump's own interests are under threat. The Colorado Supreme Court disqualified Trump on December 19th. SCOTUS took up the case on January 5th and heard arguments February 8th, and now, less than a month later, the justices have resolved the case in Trump's favor. The court's ultra-accelerated consideration of Anderson sits in sharp contrast with its treatment of Trump's claim of absolute immunity in his criminal trial over January 6th, which the justices have, by comparison, slow-walked to the point that it appears unlikely that the former president could face trial before November. This disparity alone may provide a clue that there is something other than the law afoot in these cases. Anyone in need of another clue can look to the majority's unsigned opinion in Anderson, shielding Trump from removal by the states. This case involved a genuinely difficult dispute. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, enacted in the wake of the Civil War, bars former insurrectionists from reclaiming office, but does not explain how this bar should operate. A group of voters urged the Colorado courts to enforce the amendment on their own, under a state law that lets voters challenge any candidate's legal qualifications for office. The Colorado Supreme Court heeded the call and dumped Trump from the ballot. All 9 justices have now agreed that states may not unilaterally disqualify a presidential candidate. I don't really understand exactly why they came to that conclusion. I don't see why they can't disqualify a presidential candidate in that state. There's still 49 other states that have to make their own decisions. They're not disqualifying them completely, just from running in the state. And I think, well, if you didn't file petitions to get on the ballot, for instance, if you forgot, is that a state, banning or challenging legal qualifications? Well, in that state it is. Yes. Anyway, doing so, they reasoned, that is, disqualifying a presidential candidate, would allow a handful of states to effectively determine the outcome of a presidential election. Well, yeah, so what? Undermining the inherently national nature of both the election and the presidency itself, the Constitution's division of authority between federal and state governments cannot permit a state's go-it-alone effort to disqualify a federal candidate who's running to represent the entire country. But again, if they had forgotten to file their petitions, their paperwork for being on the ballot, what would you do about that? We just didn't file any of it. State law says you got to file it or you're not on the ballot. So you're not on the ballot. Well, but that would leave him on the ballot in 49 states. We can't have disunity among the states in terms of the ballot studies. We have it all the time. All the time. I don't know what they're talking about. Well, anyway, that is where the agreement ends. And really, there should never even have been this agreement. But they did agree for some reason. 5 justices, Roberts, joined by Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, went further. They declared that only Congress may enforce the insurrection clause against federal candidates. How exactly? The majority says that Congress must prescribe specific procedures to ascertain when an individual is disqualified under the 14th Amendment. Such procedures, of course, do not exist today. And without them, the majority insists in just a few paragraphs of sparse reasoning, the insurrection clause cannot be enforced against office seekers. Sorry. It derives this conclusion from 2 primary sources. Griffin's case, an 1869 opinion written by Chief Justice Salmon Chase, acting as circuit judge. We've mentioned it before. He was in Richmond. And Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which says, quote, Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. The 3 liberal justices wrote a separate opinion, authored jointly, to explain why this reasoning fails. First, Griffin's case was, until Monday, widely discredited. as the political handiwork of a Chief Justice plotting to run for the presidency as a great conciliator between North and South. It is a non-precedential lower court opinion by a single justice in his capacity as a circuit judge, as the liberal justices write. Moreover, Senator Lyman Trumbull, an author of the 14th Amendment, resisted the logic of Griffin's case, declaring that while congressional legislation might provide a more efficient and speedy remedy for disqualifying a candidate, it is the 14th Amendment itself that prevents a person from holding office. Second, it is bizarre to claim that the Insurrection Clause requires enabling legislation by Congress when the remainder of the 14th Amendment, indeed all three amendments ratified after the Civil War, is self-executing, meaning it does not require congressional action for enforcement. Everyone agrees that Congress need not pass a law to ensure that all persons have due process, equal protection, and freedom from enslavement. Why, the liberals wondered, did the majority create a special rule for the Insurrection Clause alone? They added that the clause does mention congressional action, but only to say that Congress may lift a disqualification by a 2/3 vote. It is hard to understand why the Constitution would require a congressional supermajority to remove a disqualification if a simple majority could nullify Section 3's operation by repealing or declining to pass implementing legislation. Right? Yeah. What doesn't make any sense. These disagreements matter a great deal. As the liberals point out, the majority's sweeping Congress-only approach forecloses judicial enforcement of the Insurrection Clause in, for instance, the context of a criminal trial involving an insurrectionist. It also bars future enforcement on the basis of general federal statutes that compel the government to comply with the law, since the majority says any congressional enforcement must be tailored to the Insurrection Clause. And it even empowers the Supreme Court to prevent Congress from disqualifying an insurrectionist in the future, because the court can claim that any enabling legislation did not adhere to the made-up rules of Monday's opinion. By blocking off these pathways, the liberals wrote, the majority foreclosed future efforts to disqualify a presidential candidate under that provision. In a sensitive case crying out for judicial restraint, it abandons that course. They continued, Section 3 serves an important, though rarely needed, role in our democracy. The American people have the power to vote for and elect candidates for national office, and that is a great and glorious thing. There's that quote. The men who drafted and ratified the 14th Amendment had witnessed an insurrection and rebellion to defend slavery. They wanted to ensure that those who had participated in that insurrection and in possible future insurrections could not return to prominent roles. Today, the majority goes beyond the necessities of this case to limit how Section 3 can bar an oath-breaking insurrectionist from becoming president. Notably, the liberals actually had Justice Amy Coney Barrett on their side, too. She authored a separate opinion expressing her disapproval of the majority's overreach, but declining to say any more because the court should turn the national temperature down, not up, because law is stupid. LOL. So, in effect, Anderson is a 5-4 decision with the bare majority effectively repealing the Insurrection Clause for federal office holders. The liberals' disapproving citations to Bush v. Gore and Dobbs give a sense of how disastrously they believe the majority went astray. I wonder whether now a conviction under 18 U.S. Code Section 2383 would even be made effective, or whether they would point to this case and say, no. An old statute already passed by Congress at the time we made this decision declaring that they needed to take action to enforce it doesn't count. It has to be something new. So there's literally nothing you can do. Even if you convict a presidential candidate of insurrection directly, it still doesn't matter. It should go without saying that Congress will not enact legislation enforcing Section 3. The Republican Party is about to nominate an alleged insurrectionist in this case as its candidate for the presidency in 2024. The party is complicit in the violent events of January 6th. It will not allow any insurrection-related law to clear the Senate filibuster. The whole point of a written constitution is that it can protect individual rights and democracy even when the democratic process itself is corrupted or compromised. Oh well, SCOTUS has backtracked from that guarantee just when American democracy needed it most. In their incandescent opinion, the liberal justices walk right up to the line of accusing the majority of doing a special favor for Trump. Doesn't sound like much of a concurrence, though, does it? They are right to do so, and they would have been justified to cross it. The majority had no reason to nullify the insurrection clause other than an obvious desire to ensure that no federal candidates are nixed from the ballot because of their participation in January 6th. Anyway, an optimist might say that by doing so, the majority was just trying to inject stability into the upcoming election. But close court watchers know that every time this Supreme Court waves the flag of stability, it does so on behalf of Trump, the chaos agent, oddly enough, I would add, and his allies. Anderson's bottom line outcome is certainly defensible, but the rest of it serves as an unwarranted gift to Donald Trump and the oath breakers who violently assisted his efforts to overturn a free and fair election. There, we made it to the end of the second. Actually, chronologically, the first, but the second that we read today from Mark Joseph Stern in Slate, giving a nuanced view of what happened there. But yeah, we still come back to the point that no, they probably shouldn't have agreed because they didn't get very much in return for all of this. They probably just should have said, all right, it's a 6-3 and our opinion is a dissent, not a 9-0. You probably shouldn't have thrown them the bone to say, this is unified Supreme Court. We all agreed. It makes it look, quote unquote, bipartisan, right? To say that Trump belongs back on the ballot. And it is another fun takeaway at the end there. Yes, we're only interested in bringing stability to our system, back to our system, and stability to the upcoming presidential election in which one of the two candidates is an avowed chaos agent for whom no laws have any application whatsoever. Stability to our election by allowing a candidate who forged electoral college votes last time to run. How is it possible? This is essentially, I guess I would analogize this to the way Nazis, neo-Nazis, sympathizers, actual Nazis, the people we point to today is, saying, well, look at the intolerant left. They say they're for tolerance, but every time we want to give one of our Nazi speeches, they try to prohibit us from doing so. They're hypocrites. They say they're for free speech and intolerance. Well, and for tolerance. And if that's the case, why would they oppose Nazi eliminationist rhetoric from being delivered on any and all platforms? Aha! We have them here, right? And it's the internal contradiction. If you're really for free speech, that also means allowing speech opposing free speech. Well, there are certain lines, of course. Fire in a crowded theater, for instance, and we always point to that one. Well, there are certain limitations for all of this stuff, and it is essentially it's quintessentially an unstable element in our elections to allow someone who forges electoral college certificates to run again. That's just not going to work. There's not going to be any stability that comes from it. It's impossible. You saw what he did with the last election. How could you say that letting that guy run again is going to bring stability to the system? That's crazy. And yet, here we are. But now we know at least why it is that it looks like, I guess everybody probably was going crazy for some part of yesterday. Luckily, it was in the middle of the show, so I didn't get to witness it, saying, what are we doing here? Even our liberal justices are concurring in this stupid thing. Well, yes and no. And in the end of the day, we're still stuck with the yes today. But there's some reason to believe that they meant no. And maybe we're meant to take something away from that. All right. Time now for the third break and our opportunity shortly thereafter to speak with Joan McCarter, who I think is still scheduled to join us. No indication that she's not. But, we've had our times in recent weeks. It's been a little bit rough. But anyway, I expect to be able to talk with her about the non-government shutdown. I expect she'll have some things to say about what the Supreme Court is up to. But you know what? If she defies all expectations, it's just that much more interesting and exciting anyway. So the door's wide open. All right, we'll take our break and come back. And believe me, there's a million bazillion things that we could be talking about. Could be any of them coming up next. And we got we'll call it a jam-packed end of the week, even though it's only Tuesday. We got to start working with an eye toward the end of the week because there's so many extra stories to bring you. Lots to come. Do stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Net Roots Radio. Joan McCarter is here, and we'll both clear our throats today. I have that going on as well. This is just that sort of time of year, I guess, as well. But I don't know, nothing I could ever find to actually defeat it. So anyway, I sympathize. So how's it going otherwise?
It's going.
Okay.
It's going fine.
I bet you had an exciting day yesterday watching around 10 o'clock or so yesterday Eastern time.
Yeah.
That must have, that was something. We just spent about an hour discussing how to parse yesterday's opinion in a way that I guess is supposed to make you feel less abandoned by the fact that you were confronted with the top line headline, 9-0 unanimous decision restoring Trump to the ballot. What? Why?
Yeah.
So that kind of, whatever. And I guess it really wasn't one, but yet there it is. And now what are we going to do?
I don't know what we're going to do, Kate.
We're going to have this election.
I was disappointed in the three for not just, you knew from the oral arguments that they were going to say,
yeah,
should a single state really have this power?
Yeah, that was going to be a problem for them. And because these are Supreme Court justices. These are traditionalists and institutionalists, if you will. But now we know that means nothing. Anyway, Mitch McConnell certainly taught us that. So we had every indication that they were going to end up putting him back on the ballot. But I guess there was no reason to believe that they were going to invent this weird doctrine of, there needs to be enabling legislation, but only for part of the 14th Amendment. This part, the one that's in front of us today, where we're barring an insurrectionist from the ballot. But Yeah, I mean, good point made in one of the Mark Joseph Stern pieces that we read is nobody has come forward to say that there needs to be specific enabling legislation in order to extend due process rights and bar slavery, right?
Right.
Okay,
right.
but this part, we need something extra. Yeah, even though there are already statutes on the books barring insurrectionists from holding federal office. So they have actually done this, but apparently they need to do it again.
Apparently they do.
I'm not even sure why that would be.
It's very frustrating. It is very frustrating.
Yes.
And worrisome for the January 6th case.
Yeah. Right. And also another thing pointed out there was that maybe there was this supposition, maybe they were jockeying for positions and agreeing to call what really was a dissent a concurrence so that they could strike a deal on at least denying cert to the presidential immunity case, the so-called presidential immunity case. And then it turns out, no, they're not going to deny cert to that either. So what was the deal exactly? And yeah, we still don't know. And
what deal could on this of all things bring over the liberals?
Yeah,
I mean, you can have partial concurrences, yes.
Yeah.
Can you in per curiam?
I don't know. I guess you'd have to write it, but so you would have a signed opinion instead. So maybe I don't know, but
because I know that they were there on the basic question of can states do this, and they were skeptical, all of them, in oral arguments. But then to take that extra leap, saying, "Well, Congress has to do it."
Yeah, that's
not our job.
Right.
Not our job. It's Congress's job.
It's unusual to see them give away that any power,
isn't it?
Really, but they've gone ahead and done it. It's a little bit bizarre to say the least. And again, I don't know why previous enabling legislation doesn't count. There is a federal statute. I guess there's more than one, but there's certainly one that I know of that says, if you're an insurrectionist, I mean, presumably you have to be convicted under that statute, but it does bar federal service. Does that mean, like, if you were convicted, now I'm curious, if you're convicted under this section 2383, could you then, if you were barred from the ballot, sue and say, no, there needs to be additional enabling legislation? This earlier one was on the books when the court decided this case, so they obviously ignored it for a reason. So I'm back on the ballot?
Do they have to amend it to say this includes the president?
I guess, right? There's always that question. So this is a bit of a bizarro ruling, but that's why the rest of the day was spent by everybody saying, all right, all the people who have said that this is just a political body and they decide what they want and then they find a way in legalese to quote unquote explain it. And if it doesn't make any sense, they just go, oh, well, I guess it doesn't make any sense. Well, then don't treat it as precedent if you don't like it. Like Bush v. Gore. There, we're done. Well, it was interesting to watch the rest of the world come around to the conclusion that a lot of us have already been on for quite some time.
Yes.
But not encouraging. Just
downright scary.
Yeah.
I mean,
like, oh no, shoot, we're right. Damn.
What do
we
have
weren't.
to save us if it's not going to be the Supreme Court?
I don't know. Yeah, except
I mean, we knew that the Supreme Court was not going to save us.
Yeah, that's true. That wasn't a surprise.
Having it so blatantly displayed.
I don't know. Yeah, so we don't have an institution that will step in unless, like I said, unless you consider alligator pits to be an institution. Like if Trump trips and falls in a well, we might be temporarily saved, at least from him, but that's not an institution. So, I mean, unless it's a Department of Agriculture well. So never mind. Maybe. Who would have guessed, though? Anyhow, yeah, that was a disappointing and rough part of the day. Anticipated, yes, but we weren't anticipating the stupidness in its full glory. They could easily have just said, this makes us feel icky, but not assign anything, not any particular job to Congress. They could have got 9-0 on that. So, I don't know. And in fact, they would have probably had apparently a full 9-0 with no separate concurrences / dissents if they had simply said, this makes us feel funny, and that's it. And I guess it does. And very weird, right? Also the end of this piece that I read, good point made here again. We had to add something to it. The idea that the court was saying, well, I don't know. It's all very strange and icky, but in the end, we just want stability back in our system. And the idea that, well, we're going to bring stability back to our electoral process by including Trump in it. It's like that. No, you don't understand. You may have missed this January 6th thing. It's too bad the court wasn't in session on January 6th, 2021 and surrounded by people and threatened physically, I guess. Then they might have felt differently about it, but maybe not. I mean, it's entirely possible that, well, if Trump was sitting and watching it on TV and cheering it, then maybe Clarence Thomas was too. Figuring that they're not here to hurt me. Maybe he would have felt the same way. Too bad. But anyway, yeah, no, stability for the system by including an insurrectionist who last time forged electoral college certificates. I don't get it. Do you? No, I hope not. Meanwhile, the government won't shut down until Friday unless something gets screwed up. So that's...
Yeah, I don't think it's going to get screwed up. I mean,
it sounds right.
Johnson gets really, really cold feet unless, the Freedom Caucus puts a horse head in his bed. It'll pass Wednesday.
Sounds right. Yes, and under suspension, which means
under
that
suspension
they have
again,
300 votes for it.
As we all know, Kevin McCarthy gave the Rules Committee away in his effort to secure the gavel.
Yeah.
Let the crazies have a controlling block on it, a controlling block of 3, so that they could hang anything up.
Yeah. It's a great, and I don't know that I would have been able to predict this outcome, but it's just so interesting that by granting the Freedom Caucus a controlling faction, a controlling number of seats, essentially on the Rules Committee, the upshot was far more liberal legislation. That's odd. I mean, which should tell you something too. I mean, if people were paying attention and being logical as conservatives, which obviously they're not, and they were saying, I love conservative legislation, I want as much of it as possible, and the upshot was empowering the Freedom Caucus equals far more liberal legislation, they would say, you know what, I'm out of these guys suck.
To be fair, it's 2 Freedom Caucus people and Tom Massey, who isn't actually, I don't think, in the Freedom Caucus, but is Freedom Caucus adjacent.
Yeah, right.
Just, so that we get that.
Neither is Murdery Trader Green, but no one thinks she's a liberal.
Well, they kicked her out.
Right. I don't care how you get out. Or either you never go in or you get kicked out. It doesn't really mean that much. If you vote with them all the time, I don't care. You're in. But, yeah. Okay, so I'm... I don't know. I guess you are trying to be fair. So it's possible they may look at this and say, well, I hate conservatives in general, even though I'm a conservative and not the Freedom Caucus, which it's not their fault because they only control 2 out of the critical 3.
And then the Rand Paul of the House.
Yeah.
Almost literally. He worked for him, didn't he? Didn't Massey work for
that sounds
Paul's
familiar.
Office? I think he did.
You're probably right about that.
He is from Kentucky.
Yeah.
And he really is very much a Rand Paul type. Which, as with Rand Paul, sometimes it has its fun. Sometimes he does something that's good.
Yeah.
Not often.
Right.
But sometimes.
There's occasionally, right, there's times when that bleeds over into, hey, that actually works out okay. Like now, here, for instance, this isn't necessarily his doing, but Freedom Caucus. No, we hate those guys. They're awful. We got to get rid of them. Well, on the other hand, they are enabling the most liberal possible legislation to pass at this point, because in order to get around, they're such jerks that they have to go around them and pass everything by suspension of the rules, which means they need tremendous numbers of Democratic votes. And the only way to get that is to add back liberal priorities to the spending bills and every other piece of legislation that they need to pass this way. And, so are they the most effective liberal legislators we've had in the past decade? No. But it is funny that when they take control of the Rules Committee, the legislative output gets better for Democrats. Maybe you want to... That's a good way for Johnson to kick them off.
The only way McCarthy and now Johnson can get out of the messes they're in with the Freedom Caucus is to work with Democrats.
Yeah.
And it's sort of ironic that McCarthy's big bid to the Freedom Caucus, giving him the Rules Committee, ended up reinforcing that, ended up proving that.
Yeah. The Freedom Caucus guys were not wrong at the time, thinking that it was the right play to demand seats on the Rules Committee. It looked like it was going to steer things in their direction. It's just interesting that the equilibrium brought it back the other way. And maybe if Republicans somehow retain control of the House at some point, maybe this next time around, if Johnson remains as Speaker and is nominated again, maybe he says, the experiment with the Freedom Caucus on the Rules Committee thing, I mean, you've all seen the results, the most liberal appropriations bills in a decade. Do we think we ought to continue with this dumb rule where these guys have these seats, or should the Steering and Policy Committee say we need someone else so that we can do Republican legislating this time? It might work, or it might vacate the chair.
It might vacate the chair.
I mean, okay.
This is sort of an interesting element of that, at least as far as it goes with Ukraine aid. Jeffries has more or less told Johnson that Democrats will protect him if this comes up again. If he puts Ukraine aid on the floor and Marjorie Taylor Greene pulls the trigger, then Democrats... Not all Democrats, but
enough.
He implied, he basically said, I'll let the ones who feel like they should do it and save you.
Okay. Interesting. It
sort
would be
of
funny
a
also if they didn't.
To Johnson. They've been banging on him. He got ganged up on last week by all of the other leaders, Biden, McConnell, Schumer, Jeffries, to support Ukraine aid. And, it seems to be working a little bit. He's thawing, at least on the Problem Solvers Caucus bill, which Democrats have rejected. Leadership has rejected. But, it's continuing to put pressure on him, as is the fact that leadership has a discharge petition ready to go on it. So there's that.
All right. I mean, you wonder whether or not it's worth saving him, but then, same situation on the flip side. If the outcome is the legislation you were looking for, okay, right? Yeah. Like the old Army story about, are we going to risk anybody hunting down this terrible sniper that has us pinned down? He hasn't hit anybody yet. Don't shoot him. They'll send somebody better. Okay. You have Johnson nominally in charge and having to bring everything to the floor under suspension of the rules such that Democrats get to rewrite these bills, and then the Ukraine aid goes through. He is terrible. Should we protect him? Because he's so terrible, yes. He's the worst Democrat or worst Republican leader they've got. If we don't protect him, who knows who they'll get.
Exactly. And honestly, I don't think anybody but Marjorie Taylor Greene would really look at this situation and say, we got to get rid of him 6 months before the election.
Yeah.
How many months are we now? It's March.
Oh, I don't know.
8 months before the election or 7 or,
Yes.
However many. I don't think that's going to be a fight that they want to have.
Yeah, and she wouldn't recognize that as a problem because in her district, I don't have an election in my district, so I don't care. Go ahead.
And she doesn't particularly care about her colleagues. None of the crazies, none of the House Freedom Caucus do. They are all so secure in their jobs and they don't seem to care whether they're in the majority or minority. They're just going to race hell with their leadership no matter what.
Right.
So.
And a reminder, she's not in that caucus.
But, while they're mad at him over this, and yet another CR when he said he would never do another CR, he said two.
Yeah, well, when I said never, I meant always.
The bowing to the reality of he's going to have to compromise with the Senate on this, They are mad at him over it, but I don't think that there's yet motion to vacate anger over it. That could come with the second set of funding bills that is now due on March 22nd.
Okay.
Because that's where some of the really, really poison pill riders are included.
Oh, yes, we need to straighten that out. Like, just the dynamics of what happened. So this Friday is the deadline of what? The original second tranche?
The original
or
first tranche.
Okay, so they only delayed it by 1 week, and the second tranche was always March 22nd?
No. They pushed it back to March 22nd.
Okay. When? How? With what? I forget. Does it matter? Okay, maybe not.
With the continuing resolution that they passed last week.
So the first time when they originally separated the two, did they make them a week apart, or was it more than a week?
Seems like they did.
Okay, so they pushed.
No, they were more than a week apart.
More.
They were more than a week apart.
2, 3? I don't remember. Okay,
it's
I have
so
it
hard
wrong.
to keep track. We've had how many CRs since September?
I don't
4?
know. Maybe.
Well, and then when they bifurcated them,
this is where really things went crazy.
Yes.
So so they're still separated. They're not unifying by being brought back to the same date.
We only would have ever had a partial government shutdown.
Okay.
But,
maybe that's it.
Or a whole government shutdown, but just a delayed one.
Yeah, if you eventually got around to the second tranche and failed again. All right, yeah.
At any rate,
never mind. I was wrong about that.
Big fights are going to be.
Okay. I thought that they somehow ended up getting thrown back on the same deadline date. Like, well, what did you separate them for then? And the answer is still nothing, but...
we still don't know why they separated them, other than Mike Johnson thought it was a new, fun idea.
Sometimes you just do things because you can, just to prove that you can do them. And then they could always say, if they separate them, right, and you miss one deadline and you're accused of shutting down the government, you say, no, only partially. Some part of it is open. Yeah, but only for 2 more weeks.
There is one really good thing in the bill that's going to be probably passed tomorrow in the House, and that is restoring WIC funding. WIC is running out of money fast.
Okay.
And this contains, I think, $1 billion for WIC to shore it up.
Okay, yeah, I read quickly through, all right, well, here's what's in it. But yeah, good reminder. So WIC gets a boost. There are a couple of things. And
no poison pill riders.
In this one.
Of course.
They're waiting for the next one?
$4.5 billion, I think. No, billion for House Republican earmarks.
Oh, yeah, well, they're back on that. We love those again.
And of
Okay.
course, you know what's going to happen. They're going to vote against this because it's under suspension of the rules. And so all of the Democrats will vote for it. And they know they won't have to.
Yeah.
And then they will go home and write their great big cardboard checks saying, look what I did for my district.
Right. Oh, that's a favorite game. Sure.
Yes.
Although I guess requiring it to happen under suspension of the rules means half of them will actually vote for it.
Half of them will have to. It's got to be a 2/3.
So about 100 Republican votes and about 200 Democratic votes will happen. I did, in reading the overview of what was in the bill that they're going to bring up at the end of the week, there was an interesting passage of the fight in one of the appropriations subcommittees over Republican priorities, and the chairman complaining that he was losing on all these things, and the Democratic ranking member saying, well, but we're the ones passing this thing. What are you bringing? We're the votes. That's why you didn't get what you wanted. Yes, you're the chairman, but I mean, you don't have any votes on the floor. You get 100.
It's a very good point.
But twice as many Dems will be voting for it.
They get all their earmarks.
Yeah. So that's the prerogative of barely holding on to the majority. You got what you wanted, and you'll have your ribbon cutting. What else do you want?
Which, again, I will say is one of the jobs of a member of Congress. I am not one of the people who think earmarks are a horrible, horrible thing.
No.
Because that's what you elect a representative, particularly in the House, to do. To fight for money to come back to your district.
Yes. And, this doesn't really excuse it, but it has traditionally been the role of Republicans in general to vote against the money that gets spent even in their district and then go back to their district and say, hooray for me. I'm a member of Congress. And that it's an old game. It's that much more visible when you have this kind of dysfunction too. Like when everybody was just passing the things, and appropriations bills passed with 280, 300 votes anyway, but
who's
it
gonna
was
look?
excusing. But
who's
now,
going to pay any attention?
All right. So lots of good things happening. I don't know exactly what's happening, but I understand. They keep mentioning that now, I guess there was some sort of gun rights for people visiting VA facilities. I don't know. Did you catch that one? Or was it you can now bring a gun with you when you go to fight?
No, I think it was.
What is it?
I am not sure, but there is a guns VA thing that one of the poison pills that Republicans tried to get in. It was reporting veterans going to VA hospitals who are unstable to revoke their gun permits.
Oh,
I believe Republicans did not want.
I get you.
Unstable veterans who know how to use weapons to lose their weapons.
Yes, but they will. You can keep them at home. I was wondering whether is it that, or are they saying no? From now on, you have to be able to carry concealed weapons with you when you go to the VA. No, I hope not, but maybe. I wasn't sure what the poison pill was.
I missed that part of it, but it didn't get included.
Okay. So. Oh, all right. Well, that's interesting too. I just saw that mentioned, and they didn't explain what it was, and that was my best guess. But I see. Yours makes more sense. Although, who knows? Maybe none of it makes any sense. So, could be anything.
None of anything makes any sense, Kagro.
No. None of it. And I'm reviewing all the other things that you have also reviewed that make no sense. IVF protections. We're all for that now because something Alabama, but also I have a bill to prohibit it, but now I don't anymore or something.
Right. They're facing the dilemma of saying a fertilized egg is a person and supporting IVF. A fertilized egg is a person that must be protected versus people who want to bring more babies into the world can't because they have to create a lot of fertilized eggs that will end up being destroyed.
Yeah. So they have run into
it's a real problem for them.
Yeah.
The hardcore forced birthers are against IVF.
Yes. and people who have wanted to court those hardcore forced birthers have at least joined in co-sponsorship sometimes of bills that they figured were going nowhere.
Yes.
Because IVF is actually popular.
And now they're in a bit of a bind. They are responding with things like non-binding resolutions saying we love IVF.
Okay. Yeah.
Alabama's legislature passing legislation that's only in effect until next April. Says,
that is narrowly tailored.
IVF is protected, but it expires in April.
Huh.
And while it protects IVF, it still does not dispute or overturn the Supreme Court's ruling that fertilized eggs are human beings.
Really doing little to nothing in all of that. But yeah, not surprising, of course. But why don't they get together and say, why are we so concerned with logic all of a sudden? What has happened to us? I thought we were against that. Can't we just come out and say, we're definitely for IVF? And then when people say, but you have no legislation that says as much, you say, there's immigration. That's bad.
Right. Exactly.
So, I don't know. I guess they get back to that shortly. We will see.
We don't know. Not seriously. No.
All right. Well, okay. Always needs to be some uncertainty. But the government looks like it will be functioning at the end of this week. And then...
as much as it functions.
Sometime closer to the end of March, they'll have to do it again with the other half, and we don't know how that will go.
And that's going to be where the ugly fights are. That's where people are going to raise serious hell.
Okay, so in addition to kicking the can on government closure, what they did, I guess, kick the can on poison pills. Let's not have that fight now, we'll have it later. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, next time we check in, we can start talking about which parts of the government are endangered by that fight and differentiate between the two. Okay.
Who knows what we'll have to talk about? Fallout from the State of the Union?
Oh, yeah, that too. And Super Tuesday. I got to go vote.
And Super Tuesday.
I better go. All right. Thanks for letting me go, Joan. We'll talk to you next week.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
That little boop is a yes. It stands in for yes. Okay, time now for us to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And while I'm doing my editing, as soon as I get done with that, I can go and vote. And Justice can carry you through with news from around the country and around the world in the meantime. We'll see you tomorrow.